Hi everyone, how are you doing today? So for those of you who don't know, I am Bill Buckner. I am Director of Capacity Building here at the Foundation. And I've been asked to welcome you to our Casey History Module Part 2. As you know, this is part of our new staff orientation, and the goal of this effort is to effectively integrate you into the Foundation, the family of the Foundation, and accelerate your success. Our hope is for today that it builds upon the session we had with Doug and creates a good base for our Casey Tomorrow session, which is about Casey today. If you haven't already experienced, the Foundation focuses on results. We're really results driven in all that we do. And we have a set of results that we're striving for with this module as well. And we want to share that up front. And you guys can kind of assess whether or not we accomplish those results for yourself. We have 3 results we're shooting for. The hope is that you'll be able to answer these 3 questions at the end of the session. What are the critical values and beliefs that shape who we are and how we do our work as philanthropists? The second one is, what lessons have we learned and that we believe that everyone at Casey needs to know because we cannot afford to learn them again the hard way? And then finally, what are some of the pivotal Casey milestones that best explain how we have become the foundation we are today? We believe that you began to get a sense of that with the Doug conversation, and we strongly believe you'll continue to get a better feel for that with today's conversation. But with all things related to history, it's not a one-time event. It will be something you will learn and gain over time. I personally believe that Casey is like a family, and we have a lot of family traditions, beliefs, and history. And you've joined our family, and welcome. But for you to truly understand these things, it will take conversations, it'll take dialogue, and it'll take some patience. And we hope that this session helps to build on that such that you can understand some of our stories, some of our experiences, so you can truly understand who we are as an organization. We're looking forward to having a lively dialogue with you. This is your time. It's to help build and strengthen your experiences, so feel free to ask questions, explore, and really dig. This is your time. And with that, I'm going to say once again, thank you for coming and participating. We will do a quick round of introductions. We have what we refer to as an effective question. It's part of what we often refer to as a check-in to make sure we're all grounded. We have a joint understanding of what we're here to do and accomplish. And so today, our effective question is, what questions do you still have about Casey history, thinking about the Doug experience? So what are the open questions that you would like for us to explore today? So if we can go around the room, and you can introduce yourself, say what group that you're a part of, and your perspective on what aspect of Casey history do you still have questions about, and Steph will capture them on the flip chart.
Oh, sure. So I'm Danielle Terrain, Senior Associate with the Baltimore Civic Site. And I think that my question would be about community and resident engagement, especially with the Making Connections work. So what has worked, what hasn't, and how does that inform where we're going as a foundation in that arena?
Hi, my name is Carrie Libby. I'm a program assistant with CCEO. And wow, you kind of put me on the spot. I don't know if I have a question just yet. I guess I'm doing some work with the housing portfolio, so I'd kind of just like to know maybe a little bit more about that. It seems to kind of jump across units a little bit. So if somebody happens to have an answer for that.
Hi, I'm Danielle LePeau, Senior Associate, Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. I unfortunately missed Doug's presentation, which probably answered my question. But I guess I'm interested in sort of knowing more about the peaks and valleys of how different aspects of Casey have learned from each other on common themes and issues. So weaving together both of those first ones, I guess.
I'm Cynthia Weaver, Senior Associate with Evidence-Based Practice. And you know, one of the things that occurred to me when Doug was talking, I was fascinated about the 10 weeks that he spent at UPS in every capacity. As someone who's about to take over the lead in the implementation of evidence-based practice in our group, in our site, I've been really interested in logistics. And so I was thinking, what a fascinating experience for him. And you know, have there ever been any cross-pollination, if you will, opportunities between you know, UPS, they're all about logistics, and what we do with evidence-based practice?
Hi, Kelly Akery. I'm an administrative assistant, and I split my time between the Office of the President and Talent and Leadership Development. I don't have a question at this time.
Hi, I'm Kim Prather. I'm the Manager of Benefits and Talent and Leadership Development. I guess I just want to know more about what's worked and what hasn't worked through the history of KC and how it became what it is today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Shatskin. I'm a Senior Manager in Strategic Communications. And I am interested in hearing about how the foundation made decisions during the recession, both about how to change its grant making, how to change its focus, and how to deal internally with some of the questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Yvette Jackson, and I'm a Senior Associate with the Child Welfare Strategy Group, and I don't have a question right now.
Hello, I'm Tyra Brown. I'm an administrative assistant with Child Welfare Strategy Group. And I would say my question is, what became the final deciding factor as to why to get rid of KC Family Programs?
Good afternoon. My name is Doreen Chapman. I'm a Senior Associate with the Child Welfare Strategy Group. And I don't have a question right now. Maybe later, probably.
Hi, I'm Amina Omar. I'm a program assistant with Family Economic Success within CCEO. I have questions, but I've been asking them today. And it was, you know, it was mostly, you know, trying to understand how you decide to fund things and at what level, and yeah.
Hi, my name is Natani Edie. I'm a program associate with the Child Welfare Strategy Group. I've been a consultant with the Child Welfare Strategy Group for a year, so I think I'm a little okay on knowing a little bit about KC.
Hi everyone, I'm Kahina Haynes. I'm a program assistant with the Evidence-Based Practice Group in CSI. And I know I'm going to have questions, but I don't have any not just yet.
Hi everyone, my name is Marian Amwa, and I'm with the Knowledge Support Group. I'm the Senior Associate for for Performance Management. I really don't have a question now.
Hi, I'm Elin Jones, and I work in the Communications Strategy Group, Strategic Communications Office. I work directly supporting the programs in the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. And I guess that coming from state government to this job, there are many differences. And I guess my major question is just getting a sense for where other folks are coming from and how well they've been able to integrate those different environments into what I'm fast learning is a very distinct KC culture. So just interested in personal ideas about how those integrations can happen quickly, smoothly, and benefit all involved.
Hi, my name is Jamil Hines. I'm a program assistant in the Talent and Leadership Development Unit, and I have a short question on the Foundation's perspective on and use of strategic grant making.
Hello, I'm Ryan Fox. I'm a communications associate in the Strategic Communications Unit. I guess I have two questions. One is a general question, just how has KC kind of how effective has Casey been in crafting its message in previous years and communicating our goals to the public and internally? And my second question, I guess, is our relationship or lack thereof, or how we interact with the other Casey foundations, Marguerite Casey, and the Casey family programs.
Hi, my name is Mei Ng, and I joined the investment office at the foundation. And my questions are just about lessons learned. I think they've mentioned before.
Hi there, my name is Amrita Morris. I'm in CCEO. I'm the Senior Associate for Family Centered Community Change. And my question is about our learning over time about racial justice and equity, and how that's changed both our external posture in the sector, but then also more interestingly for me, how it's changed our practices internally.
So once again, thank you. I think that you guys have listed an incredible set of questions. I am highly confident that our panel, if not today, tomorrow, will answer all of them. So given that I'm not the one that has to answer the questions, easy, no problems. But I wanted to just spend 2 seconds providing context on how the 2 days were set up. Today is really a continuation of this idea of exploration of history, how our values, principles, and lessons learned has driven who we've become, with tomorrow being really grounded in who we are and how we've become who we are. So the two are closely related. We thought that it was best, instead of giving you mounds and mounds of reading materials, we thought it would be best to bring individuals and for them to give their perspectives of it from a historical perspective as well as the work that they're doing today. I've talked about it as creating a tapestry, and hopefully with more perspectives, the picture becomes richer and richer. And our hope is, and one of the reasons why we wanted to bring you guys together, that you guys will also start communicating amongst yourselves more, such that you can build on your own collective experiences as well. Today, the biggest chunk of the day will be a panel. We'll create time during the panel for questions and answers, and we'll sort of wrap up today's session in time for a reception. And then we will go until tomorrow. We will start tomorrow morning at 8:30 with a breakfast. We'll start at 9. We will have a welcome by Patrick, and then we will lead off into a Casey Today panel as well. And so that's sort of how the 2 days flow together. Once again, feel free to ask lots of questions. This is your time. And at this time, I'm actually going to invite our panelists to come up to the front.
Could somebody please do damage to those people?
Wasn't construction, I can't control either.
My shirt.
Nice suit you're looking very Patrick-like.
So first let me say thank you guys for agreeing to participate in this session. I am personally looking very much forward to it because I know each of you. I know that having a fully scripted set of questions would probably not be fully successful. I tried to provide in advance some thought starter questions, but can I at least ask for you guys to be like really targeted, at least with one question? Can you at least share your name, the work that you currently do, and how you first came to the foundation? And from there, I will let you guys talk. I may interject, but you guys sort of know what the goals of the session are. You heard their questions as well. And we will go. We have 90 minutes. I'm hoping that we can have a discussion between the three of you for about 40 to 45, and then we can open it up to the full group for the second half of the session.
Great.
Does that sound reasonable?
Sure.
We'll give it a shot. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you. I'm Donna Stark. I work in talent and leadership development. And before I say anything more, I want to express deep appreciation, one, to all of you for coming today. I know you're all very busy. You've got lots of work to do. So thank you for showing up today. Of course, I want to thank Bill and Steph and Emily and Maxine, who have been working tirelessly on creating an opportunity for you to feel both welcomed and knowledgeable about the foundation. So thank all of you. I've been at the foundation, it'll be 19 years on June 1st. And the way I was a grantee of the foundation for 5 years when the foundation had an initiative called, I don't know what it was called, but there were 3 states.
Really made a difference.
Yeah. It didn't matter what it was called, it just mattered what we did. So there were 3 states that the foundation was funding: Connecticut, Maryland, and North Dakota. And the idea was to work at the top levels of government to try to reform the way agencies provided services and financed services to kids, mostly kids. We weren't spending much time on families. So I did that for 5 years. When I was ready to leave that body of work, just happened to coincide with the moment when the foundation decided to move from Greenwich to Baltimore. I was working in Maryland state government as a Casey grantee, and I met with Doug Nelson and told him I was leaving, and he said, well, what do you want to do next? I said, well, I haven't quite decided yet. And he said, would you like to come work for the foundation? And so that was like the second time the career fairy was sitting on my shoulder. The first time was when I got to run the Casey Initiative in Maryland state government. And I joined the foundation a couple of months after that, spent 1 month in Greenwich, Connecticut, and then here in Baltimore, where I joined these wonderful old colleagues, and I do mean old. We all are old. We're young at heart, old in the bones, but actually Bart and John were, we were all on the same team. Obviously Bart doing juvenile justice and John doing child welfare, and I was doing this thing called state level system reform.
Hi, everybody. This should be a fun afternoon, aside from the fact that you'll all make us feel terribly self-conscious about both our tenure and our ages, which has become a recurring theme around here lately in ways that it...
Hostile work environment.
No, I think we're taking up elder abuse. It's going to be a 3-generation strategy. So my name's Bart Lubau. I've been here at the Casey Foundation in one way or another since December of 1991. So that's
Long time.
It'll be 22 years of tenure here at the foundation by the end of this calendar year. And my work centers exclusively around juvenile justice reform, and a variety of issues over the decades that touched that, which included everything from the death penalty to gun violence and community violence prevention strategies. There was a brief period when I was assigned to do Making Connections work, and was actually the team leader, don't laugh, Donna, in Oakland, where they actually named the subway system after me. But other than that, I've been exclusively about our juvenile justice portfolio.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Mattingly. I am a senior fellow here. I'm currently engaged in helping the child welfare system in Tennessee and in designing a new initiative that will focus on the front end of child welfare of the child protective system. I came in February of 1992. Kathleen Feely hired us. At that time, we began to build something called Family to Family, which was our foster care initiative, which we took across the country, and I could talk about that at some length if you'd like to. I got to child welfare by running a community center, a settlement house in Cleveland, Ohio, and a little boy who we had warned the Public Child Welfare Agency was at risk ended up being killed, freezing to death in the middle of a Cleveland winter. And we got very, very angry at that, the neighborhood and community where he lived, which is not far from where those 3 young women were held captive recently. We raised Cain, got the agency, the county commissioners to hire more staff, looked away for a couple of years while we worked on gang violence and arson in the neighborhood, and discovered that the county commissioners had frozen hiring, and we were right back where we had started. It seemed to me that we could do better at that, and I got an opportunity to run a public child welfare agency in Toledo, Ohio, not too long after that. And it seemed to me that the lesson I had learned in the city of Cleveland was that community groups and community people have every bit as much interest in the children in trouble and the families in need as any public agency does. So we began there and developed it into Family to Family, the building of community partnerships in the child welfare system. I left the foundation in 2004 to become the commissioner of the Administration for Children's Services in New York City, and came back in September of 2011. So it's good to be back, and it's good to see all you here.
So, thank you. My first question for the 3 of you, and you guys can take it in whatever order you want, is sort of, why did you come to the foundation? And more importantly, why have you stayed?
I'll start only because I didn't answer your first question fully. So at the time that I came to the foundation, I was the director of alternatives to incarceration for the state of New York. That's all I've done my entire adult life, is work around reducing the number of people who are locked up. And the foundation was, at that point, as you probably heard from Doug's description, embarking on a series of multi-site, multi-year initiatives that in many ways have become sort of a characteristic of Casey Philanthropic Endeavors, and based on some work that had happened in the late 80s in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We were going to do a major detention reform initiative. So the foundation was in the market for someone whose business was essentially correctional population management. I actually went back a long ways with Kathleen Feely from her days as somebody in New York City, juvenile justice, and before that in the mayor's office. And through a variety of connections that we had, she knew that I was up to here in terms of my ability to tolerate state government, and had been really ready to leave for about 4 years, and reached out to me and said, would you be interested in doing this? I actually had very limited experience in the world of juvenile justice. My work was all in adult justice, but these are pretty transferable technologies, if not sensibilities. And so if there's a first lesson, the first lesson is relationships really matter. That's how people make connections, both to get work done and to get work. And I think that relevant to all of our stories. Now, for the second part of Bill's question is, why have I stayed so long?
I didn't say so long.
Bill's very fast. I think the work that we do, whether it's within public system contexts or in the contexts of disinvested, segregated neighborhoods, is often approached in ways that simply don't match the reality of the problem that people are trying to solve. So government and philanthropy thinks that major problems, whether they're social, economic, or whatever, get solved within 3-year grant cycles, a concept that strikes me as absurd. And but that's in fact the way a lot of funding organizations work, and it's the way in which government works, probably even on shorter cycles because of annual government budgets and biannual elections. So for me, what has been great about Casey, amongst other things, has been the recognition and commitment to stick with something for the long term, and to recognize that sort of arbitrarily made up grant cycles or project durations need to be driven by the work, not by some intellectual process that doesn't have its feet on the ground in that way. So I've been here because, quite honestly, this has been an enormously supportive environment for a body of work that doesn't get supported in most other places. This foundation has allowed me to speak my mind, to have the resources to play with things that I could never play with in government, even when I was working with 20 times as much money, but 20 times as many political constraints. So it's just been an environment that fit well in terms of my politics, my aspirations, and the opportunities that the foundation provided.
So unlike John and Bart, who have a very specific passion for the content of their work, I'm much more of a generalist. The history of my career, my first really great job was to work in a very, very large state institution in rural Ohio, where we were under a consent decree to deinstitutionalize people with developmental disabilities who did not need to be in institutions. And that was my first exposure to how insensitive and uncaring environments could be. And it touched my heart so deeply, it was like, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to do what I can to ensure that people who are constrained in ways that they don't need to be constrained, whether it's living in a horrible institution or in a community that does not provide the kind of nurturing environment, that I wanted to do what I could to make a difference. And so over the course of many years, my environment's changed. I spent probably about 8 years working in 2 different large institutions to deinstitutionalize folks and move them into community settings. We learned a lot of lessons from mental health deinstitutionalization and why that didn't work, so we at least had some knowledge about what could work, and so that was the work that I did for a number of years. And then moved into the nonprofit sector and was working, this is also in rural Ohio, they put status offenders in group homes in rural Ohio. And these were kids whose families didn't know how to cope with their behavior. So it struck me that it was the families we needed to work with as much as reintegrating kids into those families, and it was the first time in this organization's history where families became part of the process of helping their kids do better, and for us, helping their families do better by their kids. I've also worked in government, and like you, Bart, had the experience. I mean, my job was to help the state of Maryland reform the way it served kids and families. And I thought, this is a great job. I didn't have too many allies, and I learned something very important, though. Somebody who ran the child welfare system at the time said to me, you know, Donna, you act like an architect. You need to understand I'm the plumber, that you could have these great visions for what this system could be, but I've got to make it all work. And it was a really important lesson for me, because I was like, oh, we could do this, we could do that, and feeling like, why won't they just change? There are so many ways they could do better by kids. Understanding that they had to make it work was helpful. I still found a lot of resistance, and of course the political constraints of the legislature. My first week on the job, I had to go testify. And the first question I was asked, why haven't you done more? And I was like, and it's not like they wanted to hear, well, I just started last week. You know, it's like, well, we've been hearing about this Casey work, you know, for months. And so I was like, if those of you who know Annapolis, I walked down to the pier and I thought, oh, do I jump? Or do I turn around and do what my heart told me to do? Why I stay at Casey, being a generalist, over these 19 years, I've done a lot of different things. I started with my pals here, where I was doing the state-level system reform, what I had attempted to do in Maryland. They gave me the opportunity to do in a number of states with a colleague named Ira Barbell. And then did that work for a while, then did some work with Ralph Smith on developing the Making Connections initiative. So this was the early design and development stage. Like Bart, I was also a site manager. I managed the foundation's investments in Indianapolis for Making Connections. And at that, coincidentally, I began to do leadership development work and had the opportunity to run the fellowship. And I think that's where there was the deepest connection to my passion, and whatever intellectual ability I could bring to it seemed like a really good fit. And so that's where I have stayed and feel like whatever I leave behind will certainly be found in the work of the leadership development.
Very briefly, I was recruited here by Kathleen Feely, the same person who recruited Bart.
And me. Yep.
Oh, she recruited you
Yeah,
as well?
Doug said, would you like to work? And then he turned me over to Kathleen.
She came around to that public child welfare agency I ran in Ohio. I don't remember why she was there, but she spent the day interviewing staff at all levels, and was dumbfounded to find that they weren't always in tears all the time when they talked about their work. And she was impressed enough with that, because child welfare workers spend a lot of their time in tears, struggling with very difficult circumstances. She thought I might be of some help building this family-to-family reconstructing foster care initiative. That's how I got here. I really had no particular knowledge about or interest in foundation work at the time, but it became quite clear as we started to work together that this was an organization that actually wanted to see results for poor families in communities that too often we as a society have raised the drawbridges away from and left them alone. We were serious about it. We had a lot of fun back in those days. It was a much smaller organization. But we were convinced that things that many people doubt could be done. Primarily that large public agencies, with all of their faults and foibles, and all of the problems they struggle with, from politics to fiscal policy, whatever, that they could actually do a better job at their job than they had been. I was convinced that was true from experience, and I was also convinced from experience that working with communities as opposed to dropping in on them, knocking on doors, and then perhaps taking children away from those communities, that working with communities was the way to go about child welfare. I left because I believed that, and I'm still convinced of it, that if we could prove that in a city like New York, Child Protective Services can do a better job, then there's no excuse for anybody else around the country not to be able to. I came back because the mayor's term was just about up. We were at a point where we had accomplished much, but much more needed to be done. But my family and I wanted to come back here to Baltimore, and I wanted to come back to the foundation. So that's why I'm back.
So all of you have either built or been deeply involved with work that's considered signature work here at Casey. I have two questions related to that. One is, as you were thinking about the development of this work, what were the principles that you entered this work with and how it relates to Casey principles? And then the second question is, as that work evolved over time, what were some big lessons learned, surprises, things that went well, and things that were challenges along the way?
Oh, those are pretty big questions, Bill.
Yeah, really.
So the piece of work, I suppose, that Bill's referring to, in my case, is
Making connections.
the
You're the site lead, right?
the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. And, you know, the principles, I think, were pretty forward, although needed to be articulated in certain ways. And they, you know, John just made mention of the fact that we can make public systems do better. And everybody should believe that. You know, I think in starting JDAI, the initial principle is we can get public systems to do less harm. That is, I used to describe the work purely as getting the boot of the state off the necks of the kids, and made no claim other than if that happened, communities would be better, the kids would be better, our sense of justice would be better. The issue about whether you could make the court or the probation department or the detention center actually be constructive influences in the life trajectory of a teenager, that was not even on the horizon for a while. We just figured the principle we needed to address was do no harm. You know, I think that at the heart of our work is that all kids should have the same opportunities, and that there should be a fundamental fairness that they experience in the world. And in the juvenile justice world, none of that is in fact what one finds. Even though all the best research that we have indicates that all kids, regardless of their socioeconomic status, their race, their history, engage in delinquent behavior. If you look at who are the kids in the juvenile court, and especially in its correctional facilities, they are overwhelmingly kids of color, and almost exclusively kids who come from the most disadvantaged communities and families in our society. I don't think juvenile justice is going to fix that social inequity. I think we can stop it from exacerbating it, and we can downsize it sufficiently, both so that some monies might be reinvested in the places that the kids come from, and so that we can have, in a smaller system, a system that actually could go from being taught how to do less harm to actually starting to think about how to do some good. So the other principles that were at the heart of JDAI were very standard Casey principles. Collaboration, which was important in juvenile justice, because juvenile justice is not really a system, it's a amalgam of agencies in different branches of government, and they have very poor history of planning, much less operational cooperation. We obviously believe strongly in the value of data and using data. We wanted input from community, and we knew right from the outset of the work that there would be nothing but nibbling around the margins unless we were very explicit about addressing the racial disparities that are the most characteristic element of the system. So those were a lot of the principles that were fundamental to this. Plus, it was very Casey-like. I don't know if this is a principle, but just in terms of design, this is a problem that we identified. We developed a theory about how you solve the problem, and then we went about putting together the pieces of the puzzle to actually play it out. And while we no doubt made a lot of mistakes, I think that methodology continues to hold true in many ways to this day and very much distinguishes the Casey Foundation from a lot of other foundations. The lessons, I'll let other folks talk, and I'll get into lessons learned later.
I think I start with what I believe most of us start with, which is a belief that those of us who work on behalf of more vulnerable children and families than are found in most of our own communities are basically good people who came to the work because they wanted to do good. And that leadership does matter. When I think about the early initiatives, I was working in Maryland when John was coming as the Casey person to help us do family to family. And over these many years, I really believe we can say that unless you have the right people leading the work, the likelihood of good things happening for kids is going to be very small. And when I started doing the leadership development work here, I remember a conversation with Doug where I said, and maybe it's naive, I think being naive and having a little bit of idealism is a good thing, especially if you're here. I said I really did believe that people in public agencies and doing work in communities came to this work with a sense of passion and idealism to do good. That's why they came. They wanted to do good. And that big systems over time depleted that passion and energy and sense of efficacy that they actually could do good. So my aspiration was to figure out how to get in touch with that wellspring of idealism that people working in big public agencies and nonprofits had to begin with, because I believed it was still there. And I believed that a sense of efficacy, of the ability to make a difference, would open up and reopen that passion, that exuberance, and that excitement, and that idealism. And I still believe that today, after doing this work for all these years. I see it every day in the people I work with. And that includes people here at the Casey Foundation. There was always a question, I think it's a philosophical question in the world, is can leaders be developed, or do they come that way? And I've often sort of struggled with that myself, because so many of the people I know who are great leaders seemed like it was inside of them to be that way. Well, it would be hard to make the kinds of investments of my life's work in leadership development if I didn't believe that people could grow and change, and that they could develop not just the skills, the tools, the technology, but the self as a leader and an agent of change. And so a lot of the work that I do and that we do, Bill in capacity building and his team and in our leadership development work, is really on the belief that there is something in all of us, and we can make it explicit and use it, whether it's a skill, a tool, a technology, or yourself. And like Bart, you'll hear that across all of our work, there are these beliefs and values of what we think makes a difference. Of course, data. Even in our leadership programs, everything, we start with data all the time. Data, data, data. And how do you actually use it to make a better decision than you've been making? And of course, that's the important part. It's not just about looking at data and having it, it's being able to use it. And I remember in Family to Family, John, one of the most important aspects of doing large systems change work was around using data, but the importance of creating a team of data analysts and program people, so that they were, for the first time perhaps in state government history, they were partnering to learn how to use the data to make different kinds of decisions. I think a spirit of humility, working at the foundation is a privilege. It is an extraordinary privilege. And when we go out into the field to do our work, when we partner, people know that we have, because of our resources and our influence, we could become arrogant. We are treated as if we're really special, and we're really smart, and we dress well, and it's really because we have a lot of money. And we should never forget that the responsibility of how we use those resources. It is an extraordinarily important responsibility. These are charitable dollars that, for all of us, we have a lot less money than most of the big foundations, and we do amazing work. And I think it's because we're very, very careful. We take a strong sense of responsibility for how we use these dollars to do good. And I think that is a value we have here as well. I think the importance of risk-taking and innovating. We're lucky enough to be in an environment that it's okay to take risks and to not be successful, to take a close look and an honest look at, are we making the difference we intended to make? And if we don't, if we're not, to change course and to acknowledge that what we were doing wasn't getting us the result that we wanted. So it's okay to say, okay, time out, let's rethink this. Or in the case of our partnerships with sites, if a site isn't producing the kinds of results after we've given as much help as we could possibly give, maybe it's never going to happen. I think the other value is to bring our best selves to the work, and that's our best intellectual selves, our best spiritual selves, and our gracious selves, a spirit of respect and kindness to everybody we work with, while holding the rigor of the work and making sure that both of those show up in the work that we do.
Boy, I want to reinforce what Donna just said, the last 10 minutes especially. And it's a challenge to balance those two things. There actually are two values there. One is a sense of, I don't know it all, this is someone else's work, their life's work oftentimes, and this is someone else's community. To balance that with the knowledge that we have a point of view. There are things that we believe, for example, that children grow up best with good families who are capable and who are supported by their communities, not held back by their neighborhoods, but supported by them to do the job that only families can do. We believe in that, and therefore, when we come into a community, Louisville would be a good example, where routinely police picked up children at night who were at risk of abuse or neglect, not the agency, which didn't have the staff to do it or just didn't do it. And they were routinely taken to a place called Home of the Innocents, which was a shelter where kids stayed for anywhere from overnight to 6 months. Kids aged 17, kids aged 1 month, rows of cribs, etc. So that when we went into Louisville, we had to respect what they were doing and how committed they were and how horrible their caseloads were. We needed to speak about that. But we also needed to let them know that this isn't right for kids. And in your heart of hearts, you know it's not right. So what are we going to do to get enough families available to take children in crises, and to have enough workers out there so that we don't rely simply on the police to pick up someone, to pick up a child and need to have a place to put him or her. It's that balance that I think has been the most challenging thing for me here at the foundation. It's a critical balance, and both values are very, very important. Beyond family, community, and results, which we've all talked about, some lessons we've learned as principals, some lessons we've learned that I think are important are things like there is no quick fix to these large public systems. You can't drop a new program into a dysfunctional organization which is fighting with its own community that it serves. You can't drop a new program or a new director into that kind of situation and expect things to turn around overnight. When I went to New York City, I was there for 7 years, and you're probably looking at, because of where I worked, and because New York City, with all of its problems and challenges, because of how long I stayed there, 7 years, I probably have on my shoulders more child deaths that were caused by our agencies not doing their job right than most anybody else in the country. These things do not change overnight. They take time. So there is no quick fix. There's no free lunch. Workers either have enough resources to do their job or they can't do it. And these are human beings who need to have resources. So caseloads matter. So I'll leave those simple messages out there. We also learned in a more complex way that you can change these agencies, but you have to change the top and the bottom of the organization, whichever you consider the top or the bottom. You have to change policy. You have to have people who believe in the things that we believe in order to carry the load that you have to carry to run one of these systems. You have to believe that families and children matter, and you have to play that out in your policy. So for example, we don't just say as part of our policy making, we believe in children being safe, having permanent homes, and in their well-being. Well, those are policies, they're principles, but what we really need to do is say things like, no child we come into contact with will be left alone to struggle with abuse or neglect. That's policy. That's principle. Or no family who wants and needs the help to make sure they can care safely for their children will be left alone by us without the resources they need to do their job. That's policy. You have to, beyond policy though, you have to change management and organizational structures, and you have to change the operations within these organizations. You have to make it harder, for example, for a worker by herself or just with her supervisor to decide that a family should be broken up and children removed. You want to make it a decision of the organization, so you want to bring people with experience and values into each of those discussions. So you have to change operations. And finally, and most importantly, you have to change practice. The ways in which we have done our work in the public sector, certainly in juvenile justice and certainly in child welfare, the ways of doing the work on the front line have to improve. To just simply say we'll change the structure and the policy and not do the hard work of hiring the right people, training them, supporting them as they make very difficult judgments. Without doing that, we won't change the public system altogether. So it's the hanging together of each of those pieces of the work that means it's going to take a while, and that means it's going to be hard.
I want to pick up on a couple of things you said, John. The first is around there's no quick fix for communities either. And the answer to what makes it better is found in community. I was thinking about sort of a big public system, as tough as it is to turn the ship. Our working communities are all these independent players in motion themselves. They're not well linked or geared to be in alignment. And so the challenges of helping communities become the community they want to be is equally challenging. And there is no sort of policy at the community. You know, it's got to be like who lives there, who behaves in community, and what that feels like, and how the fabric of community is strengthened and sometimes created. So I also wanted to say something about the way Casey works. Compared to many large foundations, we don't have a lot of money, but we have considerably more staff, relatively speaking, than just about any foundation in the country. Last week I was with 12 of the largest foundations in the country, and we have proportionately a higher number of staff relative to our assets than any other foundation, any other large foundation in the country, perhaps any other foundation in the country. That's about a value and a principle, which is that we go out into the communities, into the public systems, and we work hand in hand with our partners. And we do that, as everybody's been saying, because we have a point of view that we want to share. We have ways of making a difference we want to share, but we also need to learn a hell of a lot if we're going to stay good. And so it is, because there are so many of us out in the communities, it is the way we learn, it is the way our work changes over time. If we were to stay here, like many foundations do, and give big grants to intermediaries, we would become, I think, very stale. We would lose our sharpness of experience and knowledge, so that when we're trying to figure out what to do out in communities, this foundation knows better than almost any other because we're out there doing the work?
Well, this will go on for a long time, so I'm going to just make a couple of quick points about lessons learned. I think the first one for me is that, and I think it was reflected in John's examples about policy, is that you have to not be afraid to aspire big. You have to, a lot of foundations work this way. They hire a pollster and they take a public opinion poll to determine what's the proper language to use, what's the issue that they might get a little bit of influence going on, and then they frame what they say based on that feedback. I think that's a fundamentally flawed way to, in fact, aspire to make a difference in the world of kids with tough odds of making it in our society. I think you gotta pick a goal, like we don't want any kids unnecessarily or inappropriately locked up, and don't be ashamed of that, and find the ways to say it and the hooks with different people. But one of the lessons learned from doing JDAI for 21 years is that if you say something often enough, it'll become true. And I don't mean that just sarcastically. I mean, if John says, as the Commissioner of Child Welfare in New York City over and over again to everybody that he interacts with, we will leave no kid alone to fend for their safety and security that we know about, that will become the truth of New York City. And the same can be true for our work. So I think you really have to be willing to kind of get out there and be outrageous in some ways, or what may be outrageous today won't be outrageous. And in that regard, and I don't want to gild the lily, I do think that it's important for all of us to be able to reflect on the fact that things do evolve and change. And some of the things that we may have pursued but never had a lot of hope would be different are very different now. And I think, for example, that the work that the foundation's invested in juvenile justice has fundamentally turned the curve on juvenile incarceration. I don't think it's the only thing that did it, but it's been the most consistent and out there, and now the numbers are there. I think we can do those things that we dream big about if we have the stamina and the determination.
So I want to shift just slightly. We're a foundation, and you guys have touched on this a little bit, but I've had people ask, why don't we do RFPs? What about this grant making? Why do we seem a little different? Are we different, and if so, why?
I'll start. Maybe you know the language of responsive versus strategic philanthropy. Responsive philanthropy accepts lots of proposals from communities and nonprofits and says, oh, this looks like a good idea. We should fund the food bank, or we should fund this nonprofit. They're doing good work. And all of that is important to do. Very often they touch much more closely than we do directly the experiences of people who need resources. So that's a responsive philanthropy. Casey is a strategic philanthropy. So through our constant learning and bold aspirations and visions, we generate ideas. We think we can do something radically different than has ever been done before in child welfare, in juvenile justice, in family-centered community change, in all of our major aspects of work. We believe we can do something big that's going to make a big difference. So we develop those ideas, and then we look for partners that we think want to do this work with us, have the capacity and potential to actually make a difference in partnership with us. So I'll stop there.
Two more questions, and I want to open it up to the room. So, Making Connections was a huge investment of the foundation, a big bet of the foundation. Unfortunately, Frank could not be here to kind of share perspective on that. Can you guys talk about what transpired from the creation to where Making Connections ended and the impact it had on the work of the foundation?
Making Connections preoccupied us for the better part of a decade, and I'd never seen a final accounting of it, but my understanding is that we spent about $500 million on it, which is a pretty substantial piece of change. Not only that, it also, I mean, just the planning and discussions related to it preoccupied people for quite a long time, and when the decision was made to do what became Making Connections, it occupied a lot of the oxygen. I mean, took up a lot of the oxygen. Virtually every senior staff member, with the exception of Mattingly, who somehow managed
He went to New York.
managed to avoid this, was pulled into the work. So I think it very much occupied our human resources, our financial resources, and our mental spaces in many ways, both good and bad. That is, there was lots of intensive discussions about things. I think there are legacies of that agenda that are important and innovative. I think this whole notion about two-generation strategy comes out of Making Connections. I think much of the FES agenda was a response from many people on staff that said, all this nonsense about social networks is fine and well. If people can't put food on the table, stay in their homes, keep their kids clothed in the wintertime and stuff like that, then you're whistling Dixie. And we had big struggles about that, believe me. There were theories in the design stage of Making Connections that what made a difference for kids was the quality of family time. It wasn't about whether or not anybody had any money, whether the parents were employed, or I watched the tapes of Doug talking the other day and talking about public safety. Public safety got this much attention in Making Connections. It was not present. It was something we avoided for a variety of reasons, and we could have big debates about that. But there were things that people fought about, and I can remember being very proud of colleagues about taking on the struggle about what should be going on inside of this big bet. And I think that a lot of people really did push and said, no, we need more ideas. You all should understand there was a lot about Making Connections that was invented as we did the initiative. It was not an initiative that began with, like a manual that said, here's what we're going to do. And I think the adaptiveness was in many instances pretty impressive. Not without its price, but pretty impressive none the least. And I think there are lots of neat things that are still around. On the other hand, I would love to have a big debate within the foundation about what did we learn and why did we do this, and did we approach it right? But it was big for us. It really preoccupied us.
Yeah, all of that is true. We were consumed, and where we started looked nothing like where we ended. Now, you would hope that over a 10 or 12-year period that it was very different toward the end than toward the beginning. It was, to begin with, a vague notion, an important vision. Kids do well when their families do well. Families do well when they live in strong, supportive communities. And I think we all believed that to be true, but we really didn't know exactly what we were going to do to make sure all of that looked like something real on the ground. There were lots of many community conversations about what do communities want, and they wanted jobs and good schools, and they wanted safe communities. And Bart's right, we did nothing to attend or be responsive to that. It was a lesson learned, I think, and if I have any influence, I would do my best to avoid it. There were 22 sites to begin with, and so all of us senior associates, except for John Mattingly, got assigned a site. Now, many of us had never done community work or site-based work. Certainly, we were doing big public systems work when we got these assignments. And we, it was sort of a redeployment of staff without a commensurate fundamental capacity building strategy to ensure that we knew how to do it. I think the belief was, we have such smart people here, they'll figure it out. And we were sent out into the world to do it. Some of us did better than others. And so I think one of the lessons for me is that was stupid. That's not how you deploy your human capital. And I think we're in a position to say that to ourselves right now. I don't think we've done it again since. I think the other interesting thing was this balance of foundation governance versus local governance, this question of who really owned this work. Our job as site team leaders was to sweep people in, to get them to believe in these ideas, to use data to create some sense of urgency about making a difference. But it was being driven from the Casey Foundation, while we sometimes said it's really a community effort. It was out of balance in that way. And I think that speaks to, John, what you were saying earlier, like we had a strong point of view, and we were working in communities that we didn't know all that well, and we had to find the best balance we could. And sometimes that created a lot of tension, because if you were an advocate as a site team leader for what your community wanted, you had to come back and try to advocate for that at the foundation that at times was not particularly interested. There was an agenda being pushed, and there was nothing wrong. It was a really smart idea, but it wasn't always what communities wanted, and we were put in a position to try to reconcile that. Sometimes we did well, sometimes we did poorly. I think we learned a whole lot, and I think you do see it in family-centered community change, and you see it in the two-generation strategy. We've incorporated it into our own capacity building work and our leadership development work, and I think if you haven't read it, it's a fairly quick read, the Making Connections report. It really lifts up all of the lessons. It doesn't tell the more interesting story that Bart and I will tell about the struggles. I think part of what was interesting was those struggles were out in the open. We were fighting about points of view and positions, and it was sometimes with people in leadership positions, sometimes different points of view amongst ourselves as site team leaders, but it was all very transparent. So it was a healthy time for the debate, period.
So I wanted to make sure that while this was an interesting conversation, that we open it up to you guys to be able to ask our panelists whatever questions that you want. And please answer them if you can, but ask whatever questions you want. So I want to open up the floor. Are there
Bill,
things
if I
that-
could start with, there was a question on resident leadership and resident engagement, and that was part of we did a lot of that work in Making Connections, so I'll pick that up as the first response. In Making Connections, one of the things we talked about was the importance of resident voices. And that was a value and a principle, but we needed to figure out how to execute on that. And so we developed, there were lots of things going on. In some sites, there was organizing. Community organizing was a strategy. What we developed and made available to all sites was a resident leadership training curriculum, and it was co-designed with the residents. And we did it in each of the sites, and what we were really helping them build their muscle to do was to sit at the table and negotiate with people who had money and power to affect their community. So that was a skill set that we brought into each of the sites, but we also had cross-site meetings. So we had 120 residents from Making Connection sites here several times a year, and initially staffed by people who were working at the foundation at the Center for Study of Social Policy who had been doing the work in the field. We designed the first session or two, and then invited the resident leaders to be co-designers. Over time, they did all the design work, they did all the execution, and they built their skills to figure out how do you do design work and how do you teach others the kinds of skills that they were learning as well. When we got closer to the end of the Making Connections work, we began thinking about a sustainability strategy. Of course, we should have built that in earlier, but hadn't thought about it. And we engaged community colleges in the idea of creating leadership certificates for residents of the communities, primarily low-income community residents. And the deal that we made was, we've got the curriculum, we'll hand over the curriculum, but the deal was that we would pay initially to prime the pump to get students, so some scholarships, but that residents had to be co-teachers with people at the community colleges. And over time, what you began to see was people coming for these courses so we could scale back our investments and scholarships. Began to see in a number of cities these residents who were co-faculty actually being retained at the complete expense of the community college to continue teaching the certificate course.
So the floor is sort of open.
So Bart and Donna, you mentioned that Making Connections did not address public safety, but you didn't really say why not, and I wondered if you could elaborate.
Well, this is an opinion, not a fact. I believe there were some, well, first of all, there's the dilemma that Donna described about who was in control of the agenda and what was being measured as success. And in that regard, I think there was a serious concern on the part of certain foundation leaders of being on the hook for outcomes that were very complicated to account for, public safety being one of them. Although, interestingly enough, public safety is one of those things that is more amenable to neighborhood solutions
Right.
than the other problems that we were trying to address, like poverty, where nobody thinks about it in terms of neighborhoods, so, unless they're gentrifying. So that, from my basic take, Kate, was that this was taking on an ambition that we didn't want to be accountable for.
I would agree, but I'll add that communities took it on, and they didn't need us to say it was okay to do or to prevent them from doing it. That's what they wanted to do. So although we were concentrating on jobs and assets, attachment to the workforce, and school readiness and early childhood health, as they sort of built, at least from my experience, they built their power base. That's what they did. They took on community safety. They took on the mayor's offices and the police, and they made changes and demanded changes in their communities regarding public safety that had nothing to do with our interest or lack of interest.
Like I need a microphone. I guess I'm interested in how Casey balances these sort of dual ideas of protecting children from the harm that systems do inherently, to shifting to a more lofty, intangible goal of having systems do good. Like if we know that we haven't yet gotten, to borrow Bart's phrase, the boot of the state off the kid's neck, at what point is it okay to shift some attention away from taking the boot off the neck and making the boot more comfortable?
It's a fundamental difference in my mind between the public function of child welfare and the public function of justice or corrections in general. I've done both. One of my first accomplishments in the work was to close the Camp Hill prison to juvenile delinquents back in the mid-'70s, placing 450 of those kids outside of the realm of the correctional system, right up to the end in New York City, where we closed Spofford, the infamous Spofford, a detention center that had been there for many, many years. And it is true, and while it is true that as troubled and damaged as the child welfare system is, it does damage to the children who come into care. Not always, but too often. And it does seem to me essential that we fix that, to not deal with that, and to expect that if we move away from these neighborhoods and communities, children will no longer be hurt, is a false romanticism in my mind. These kids, day in and day out, are not being protected by the only people there are in this strange society that we live in who are obligated to care for and protect them. Because our community sense is so weak, and our social safety net, as it's been called, is virtually non-existent. We need a public response to these children's crises. And to avoid doing that, to do what we've done too often in this field, and I've seen it now for 30 years, where we emphasize solely family preservation, or we emphasize, as Casey Family Programs does right now, that we want to cut the number of kids in foster care in half in 20 years. To emphasize those things is cheap and easy on the part of people with our values. That is a value of community and commitment to family. And our belief that the poor communities of our cities especially are left alone to struggle too much by the society as a whole. But to take that as the sole response is to leave hundreds of thousands of children at risk. And it's my belief that we must do better. It's not the question of do we have a choice of not doing something or of not doing anything. I don't think we have that choice. So that's why I'm committed to making our systems better. Corrections, another story in many ways, but not in every way. Our Child Welfare Agency in New York City has taken over responsibility for those kids who've been sent upstate to these horrible facilities run out of small towns throughout New York State, because we believe that while we wouldn't do it perfectly, we do it back in New York City, and we do it in their neighborhoods, and we do it better than they could do. And rather than simply saying we should close all those facilities, which in fact I think we should, we have an obligation to care for these kids as well. I'll stop.
So I'll very quickly say, Danielle, as you've heard me say many times, I don't think there's a formula for this yet or necessarily a science. I think this is pretty arty in stuff. John leaves out that what happened in New York City relative to changing the youth corrections model would not have happened without two key leaders being in place. And it was that time and the groundwork that had been done that made that more possible. So I think this is, I don't think we're going to find a formula around this. I think we know some of the general things about if you can't break a system of its addiction to punishment, that it's probably a bit naive to think that it's in the business of caring. So you got to be able to come up with some ways of kind of feeling that or measuring that. And then similarly, I would think that the whole process of getting systems to do things that are less about reducing the harm they do and more about doing good will also be similarly incremental, because we're going to have to see whether or not they get perverted because we didn't get back to a baseline that enabled places to actually put good ideas in place and take advantage of them.
I'm curious to know if there were any big Casey decisions or ideas that you did not agree with, or at least initially thought too outrageous.
Oh, she's bad.
I like her. What? Amina, right? Good. So I'll say two things. I didn't like making connections, right? I didn't understand the theory. If you didn't get that, I went and did it. I was a good soldier, and I participated in those struggles that Donna mentioned, but it didn't make any sense to me as an initiative. The second thing is, and I watched the videotapes of Doug Nelson and his reflections to you last week, was it?
Yeah.
All right. So I think there was a bit of revisionist history going on there as pertains to the Casey Foundation's explicit intentional commitment to address issues of racial disparity. Okay? I think it was a huge struggle in this foundation, waged largely by staff and grantees, to say that it did not suffice that because your mission was to improve outcomes for disadvantaged kids, that meant somehow by definition your work was about the effects of race and ethnicity on children and families and communities. I thought it took a very explicit struggle that lasted for about 10 years before the position that you heard last week actually became something that you could see manifestations of race and equity portfolio and those, race matters kind of tools, that sort of stuff.
Donna?
I actually, I would agree with that making connections was poorly constructed to begin with. I loved doing it though. And what I loved about it was, I came from public systems work, and I loved being in communities and doing work in neighborhoods. I really had a good time. I learned a lot, and I stretched a lot, and felt like I was part of figuring it out. So, beginning, who knew? But then it was like, okay, it's my job to figure it out. And so that felt fun and exciting and a very big learning opportunity for me. And, Bill, I go back to the question about why do you stay? There's always something, there's always a stretch, always a stretch. There's always another solution to be sought. There's always another opportunity to grow. And so for me, my mind is never at rest. It's always like cooking. And so, and in making connections, you had to be doing a lot of cooking because you had to invent it. So I would agree with you that there was lots wrong with it, but I also had a lot of fun.
And Donna was great. And by the way, I just want to clarify, I didn't say that I didn't like the work. I just said I didn't like the initiative.
Yeah. I would also agree that issues of race were, there was a lot of tension in the foundation around race. Sometimes it was expressed as the difference between working in public systems and the difference in working in communities. Sometimes it was expressed as paying attention to data as opposed to paying attention to what people have to say. And we fought about that all the time, but the basis of all of that was about race and about the tensions within the foundation, about who had influence and resources and power and control and who didn't. So we were our own microcosm of the rest of the world around issues of race and class. And, as I look out into the audience, and Doug said this to you, and I look at the panel up here, Bill and I talked about this, and I said, well, Bill, how can you put 3 old white people up here? And it was like, it is what it is, And so it really, wonderful to see how, and Doug's interest now, when Doug talked about being a grantee, the work that he is doing is on reducing racial disparities, raising those questions in the community where he lives. But when you look at the foundation today and you see the change in the kind of diversity at every level of the foundation and the kind of influence you all have in your work, I think we're in a much better place. We're certainly far from being really, really good at taking up issues of race and class here, but we're way better than we were.
Just a word. Just to add, first of all, the only reason I wasn't involved in making connections is that I was off to New York. So let's be clear about that. Although I'm not sure that Ralph would have had me.
Talk about revisionist history.
I'm not sure Ralph would have had me. But there was an aspect to this that Donna briefly mentioned that was particularly difficult for me. There were problems with the logic model to begin with that never really were dealt with, that were raised by us about how you can, I come from community-based work. I come from neighborhood work. and I know how neighborhoods function, and I know that some neighborhoods which are producing the worst results for some of our children and families have been like that since the 19th century, and they are the place where people come first, and they're the place that people move away from when they are doing better. And you must consider that as you consider how you're going to change, how you're going to use a place-based approach. Those places are more complicated than we knew. But setting that aside, there was also here a strong cultural divide between the good people who were committed to community work and the other people who were committed to these damn terrible institutions, right? These child welfare agencies and correctional agencies. You could feel that all the time. And that, because I come from community and because Family to Family was so committed to community partnerships, that pissed me off. I'll say that right out. The other problem that I had is similar to the question you asked, which was right on, is that Casey Family Program, until the mid to late 2000s, was not doing permanency work the way it needed to be done, was not seeing to it that these children were adopted by the families that we spent so much money supporting, and was not doing work to return children home who could have been returned home to their family. That was because the history of that agency was it was a long-term foster care program. These were Casey's children. They weren't the family's children. They were Casey's children. That's the way we talked about it.
So, John, did you mean Casey Family Services?
Yeah. Although Casey Family Program was doing the same thing. That's another story. They were doing a very similar thing. So here we are out there pushing the question of why can't we see to it these children go home sooner, or aren't removed at all if they don't need to be, or are placed with adoptive families from the day they come into care. We're raising those issues, and we have an agency that we hold up high that wasn't doing any of those things. Now, thank God, beginning 2005 thereafter, Casey Family Services finally began to move forward toward those values that I've been talking about. So there was a split here around that issue as well. It wasn't just making connections, it also was Casey Family Services' place in the organization.
We got 1, then 2, then 3.
Well, I hate to turn this into a Making Connections forum, but I get the overall sense that Making Connections was a overall failure. I don't know if that's too strong of a word. There are so many good things that came out of it, but I do get the sense that it was an overall failure. And if that's not the case, are we batting 100? I know John may have touched on it, Bart may have touched on it, some of our kind of shortcomings, but are we batting 1,000, so to say, for the programs that we do take on? Did we have any other failures in our history?
I don't think it was a tremendous failure at all, Making Connections. If you look in communities where we worked, the work happens differently now. In places, I was in Indianapolis never used, nobody was using data. Nobody sat at the table together and said, what does the data look like for our city and our community? They do that today. They would not have done that without Casey's influence. Residents who were pretty powerless when we began our work are now on school boards. They're working at foundations. They're running big nonprofits. We made a contribution to that. We don't claim to own all of that success as our doing. I think a focus on results, knowing where you're heading, we got there eventually. It was late in the game, but and that was a really hard turning point with our sites. when we discovered that we got clear about what results we were trying to achieve, we had to say, oh, and now here's what we think you need to achieve. And they were like, what? We're 5 years into this initiative. When did this happen? So it was a huge struggle, but today people in these communities talk about achieving results. They're clear about what they want to achieve. I think there's a different kind of collaborative investment by government and foundations and nonprofits in the communities where we were working.
Thank you for asking that question, raising that issue. I think it's a very important one. I certainly have never been and am not now in a position to bash any other program here, especially Making Connections. So I don't want to leave the impression that it was a failure. I'm not sure, as Donna said, I think a lot of good came out of it. Nor would any sane child welfare director or child welfare person ever say we've been batting 100%. You know, you're lucky to get from 30 to 40%. And you're really lucky if you get above 50. So I don't want anyone to think that anything that I've been saying about either of our works, although Bart's has come much farther in the last few years, I don't want anyone to think that's the only way to do this work, because I don't believe that. There are a lot of ways to do it. And just focusing on public agencies is not necessarily the only one.
And just to go to your batting average issue, we're nowhere near batting 1,000, and there are initiatives that I don't think anybody, I mean, I think one of the good things that we do is design work in ways that even if the stuff turns to dust, there's going to be some lessons that get learned, or some good tools that come out of it, or some bright ideas, or we'll find great new leaders or get an insight about something. But I think if we listed all of the different major initiatives that happened, and if you asked people to, like, if they only had a choice, successful, not successful, be a lot of not successful there, starting back with the original stuff, the stuff that got Doug hired as president. I don't, you know, New Futures. I don't, you know, I don't know that that was a success, except insofar as what we learned. But if success was defined as turning the curve on key results for middle schoolers, you know, not even close. And we could go down the line with a lot of stuff like that. But it doesn't mean that they can't be very productive building blocks.
Yeah, I think about New Futures, and then there was an effort which we haven't even talked about called Rebuilding Communities, which was a very early precursor to Making Connections, and then Making Connections. And of all that work, and that's really 20 years of work, today we have 2Gen and family-centered community change. I don't know that we would have had the knowledge and the insight and the fundamentals to get to where we are today in the absence of having learned so much over these past 20 years through our community change initiatives and investments.
As excited as I would be to continue this focus right here, especially around family-centered community change and lessons there, I want to go back to the racial equity, racial disparities question, because I think you several of you talked about the tensions and where we didn't live up to, right, some of what we would have wanted to in earlier days, and continuing to have work to do. I'd love for you to talk more explicitly about what you think we're doing in practice right now that you are proud of, or you think are very tangible ways in which we've grown in that area, and then to the point around, if you say things enough, you know, they will come to be as outrageous as they may be. Where would you like us to sharpen our focus and our practice around addressing disparities?
Just to step back a little bit, I hope I won't spend much time on it. We've had a tension here at the organization to be clear about what, in my view, and I I think my colleagues' view, is a fundamentally unjust and racist society, especially for the communities we have committed ourselves to work in primarily. Because we have a larger face to show to the world and to our board, you don't hear that sort of pointed discussions. And that's there, and it's, I think, one of the things that has kept us moving in the direction we've gone in is sort of not confronting issues that way or that directly. If you, for example, work in public child welfare, you'll see the tremendous disparities between especially African American children caught up in the child welfare system as compared to white children or even Hispanic children, except as you move farther west. Several people allied with the foundation took the stance that this was just driven by the child welfare agency's decision-making. You change the decisions that get made, you will change that disparity. Casey Family Programs has sold that around the country until finally 2 years ago the facts came out that now we have sufficient research that in fact African American communities of certain kinds and white communities of certain kinds, and there happens to be a lot more African American communities of certain kinds, do in fact neglect and abuse their children more often. That's not something people want to say or to hear, and it's certainly not racial. There's no basis for African American families abusing or neglecting their children more than the rest of the society, but there is in the communities we serve most. Rather than, we stood firmly, although with some dimensions of argument, that the cheap and easy way of blaming it on this public agency and just simply teaching your workers to no longer remove African American children is not only wrong, it's harmful. That is the sort of direction we went in, and our commitment to this work was turned into something community-focused so that our staff and our consultants were from those communities and worked in those communities and helped us, especially, for example, in New York, to make better decisions because they were at the table when a child's removal was on the table. That's a lot harder, more complicated, takes enormous change happening within the organization, but that's the only way I think you can address it. The thing that we did that started child welfare down the right road, this is 20 years ago, is with our researchers' help, we built a picture of the disparities at the entry point, at the decision-making point about going home, about the long-term foster care point, and about adoption. And once we were able to show our communities the disparities right there in front of everybody, that made a big difference in how we saw our job and how communities responded to us to say, we want part of this. This is our work too. We want a piece of it because these are our children. I'll stop.
So, Rita, I'm trying to remember the question was sort of like, what do you feel best about?
Yeah.
No, I thought that was great, John.
More explicit ways you believe we're addressing disparities now, even through the struggles of what
Yeah.
might have pushed more in the past. I know Donna talked about the face of philanthropy changing, represented by this room, but I mean, really getting even beyond that with our practice.
Well, I actually think that in some ways practice preceded the changes in the internal environment. That is that we, the people started to address, whether it was John painting a picture of here's how disparities arise, are sustained or worsened or abated in child welfare, or us in JDAI saying this has to be an explicit strategy and actually trying to develop tools and processes and institutions in the field that we would help form and support and position to play an influential role. I think that that was, I mean, one of the great things about working here is the latitude that you are given. You're given a lot of rope, and you know, you can either use it well or hang yourself. And so if that's your vision, that's where your passion is, that's what your politics and your values are, you can pursue that the kind of thing aggressively. And I think in both child welfare and in juvenile justice, we did some of those things. I think within the organization, there were struggles about both the composition of the workforce and the competency of the workforce, and then those boiled over to issues about who are our grantees. We're giving out $150 million a year. Who's getting the dough? Do we even look at that? And does it suffice if the money is going largely to these entities of government or large white operated nonprofit think tanks? Even if they're on the right topic, couldn't we do better? Couldn't we be building a more equitable society? And now, as you all know, we have things like we keep track of data about our grantees. 20 years ago, that was not something we were going to do. We didn't even have a diversity report about our own staff back 20 years ago. So I think those are all signs of progress. Should anybody be overjoyed? No, I think that complacency is certainly not called for, certainly not self-satisfaction, but this, in my lifetime, will always be an issue that people struggle over. This is never, it's not going to be something that our society will embrace in a different way while I'm still on this planet. So I don't see why it should be any different here at the foundation, that it has to constantly be something that we push ourselves about. Otherwise, the status quo will just hold.
I'll just add a few things. The first is some of the things I believe we're going to be proud of that are just coming off the drawing board. One is we do publish our workforce composition on our website, and in July we will have a comprehensive diversity report that'll talk about our workforce composition, our grantee diversity, and our racial equity portfolio. So we're just, now that we've got all of you hired, I can get Maxine's attention on getting us the diversity data. The second thing that some of you may be aware of is a partnership between the racial equity portfolio in capacity building and external affairs. We're developing a racial equity opportunity index, and it will be publishing a data and policy book. It'll be called Race for Results. And Lisa and I and all of our partners and staff meet regularly to figure out what the index should be, what do we want to say, what are the policies, and that the first publication of Race for Results will be out no later than the first quarter of 2014. And we believe that, like our Kids Count data book, we will publish annually how this country is doing on equitable opportunity for the kids and families we care about. So that's pretty cool. And there's a lot of human capital and financial capital that has to go on behind that. And so it speaks to the commitment to keep going and to never be satisfied. The other thing that's coming out of the racial equity portfolio is a racial equity practitioners network. These are people around the country who have spent their lives working on racial equity, and we are convening them. They'll all be here June 20th and 21st for their first meeting. And the task that they have is to get to know our work really, really well, and then to begin working, and I think Ryan has volunteered to be our first partner in figuring out how we can support your team in doing better racial equity work. So these practitioners will get to know the work, they'll know what you're already doing, honor what you're doing and the communities with whom you're partnering, and then we'll try to figure out what value can we add. So thank you, because we really appreciate the opportunity to learn with you. And then the aspiration is to move around the foundation with interested partners to deploy these practitioners in support of the racial equity work of the foundation. As we do this work, we also have an interest in sharing what we're learning and doing with the field to try to build the field of philanthropy's capacity to do better racial equity work. Also, we have renewed energy in the RESPECT group. Leon has taken over the leadership of that group and comes at it with his own passion and strong leadership to continue the work of paying attention to what the foundation needs to be thinking about around racial equity work. So there's some stuff going on, and everything that each one of you are doing. And one of the things when we were thinking about the racial equity practitioners is to acknowledge that every single body of work at the foundation has been addressing for 20 years in some cases these questions of disparity gaps. And even in every piece of new work that we do, that is always at the forefront. So our job is to support you in doing the work that you're passionate about and care about and want to do well.
And I just want to interject, you asked the second part of your question around long-term aspiration around race equity. And so I just wanted to interject that what we've talked about within that work is that a child's race or ethnicity will no longer be a predictor of their well-being or their future. So that's
our results statement.
As we've reflected on your past experiences within Casey, I'm just kind of curious as to what each of you envision for the future of Casey and its growth, and what advice you would be able to give us within that vision.
And I'll start. There's so much fabulously new, interesting work going on around the foundation. Bart's work looking at the deep end with the aspiration of closing every training school in the country. John's work on really looking at how children are protected in community, our two-generation and family-centered community change work. In the Center for Systems Innovation, there's a deep dive into this frontline practice. How do we make sure that people who directly touch kids really know what they're doing and kids are getting the best that's could be gotten for them? As I was saying earlier, one of the things I love about being at Casey is there's always something new and interesting. And so, and part of why all of you are here is to do that work, evidence-based practice, the evidence to success work, building a body of knowledge around what works, and then trying to help communities and public systems actually use what works. And that is a huge body of work to take on. And so to me, that's all fabulously interesting, and the next 20 years of our work.
I just want us to have an edge and to have fun doing this stuff, because it's hard, and if you can't get to know one another and enjoy the fact that you're working really hard, it's not a good place to work. So I hope we can have an edge as we go forward.
Yeah, I think John makes a really important point, and alluded to it earlier on. Many years ago, when the three of us began working here, it was a fundamentally different scene. We had a staff meeting around a big conference table. That's how we would work. When somebody had a meeting at which lunch was brought in, lunch was brought in for everybody because it was, I don't know, there were 25 people or something like that. And one of the things that I think we really need to struggle with is how do we maintain the intimacy and the familiarity with each other that characterized that early environment, even though growth may be something that's very predictable and necessary. But I'm always railing about the two-building situation. Part of the reason why I was willing to do this was because I wanted to see all the new faces in something other than a once-a-month staff meeting. And so I think we're going to have to work really hard at being creative about how to build a sense of community, both because that's a better environment in which to work, but also because the subject matter of our work takes much too much of an emotional toll if we are into it and really serious about it to be sustainable without each other. So we got to find ways to do better about that.
I have 3 questions in queue, and then if there are any final ones, we want to try to wrap it up and be respectful to the panelists as well.
Great. Thank you so much. My question's similar to Amaretta's. It has to do with changes in practice internally, like within Casey, but it's in regards to program implementation and development. And I just want to know your thoughts on this balance between the iterative and kind of adaptive nature of programs, and then balancing that with like our sort of ethical imperative to do good, and how that relates to testing programs and piloting them before we go into these communities. So how are we taking like those lessons learned from like the Making Connections, how are we embedding them into our actual practice currently? Because I personally am probably part of a few things right now that I think are also kind of building as we go. So how are we taking kind of those lessons learned and actually making sure that we take them into consideration with our current practices?
Well, I think it's a great question, Kahina. I think we do it differently in different bodies of work. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't know that the way you should think about these issues in something like evidence to success is necessarily the way that we would think about them in family to family or in JDAI. Maybe. I think the tragedy would be if you don't have the benefit of the lessons and they don't get into your intellectual mix. So if you're doing this stuff in isolation and as if there's no history, well, that just seems to be a waste. On the other hand, and this is something that I think people in your position are in a good place to give us feedback about, I don't know whether it feels like you have an opportunity to discuss those lessons and think about their application going forward the way some of us do. I think in the context of individual bodies of work, that kind of exchange goes on all the time. I think, like in the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group now, we wrestle a lot about, well, we did this in JDAI, should we do it in the deep end work, and where do those things fit together? I think it's often hard, though, for that to cross some of the big barriers. The most notable one is the one that John described rather accurately earlier, between sort of this division that existed between the people who worked with systems and the people who worked in communities was a dichotomy that was not only a misrepresentation of the work, but prevented the sharing of lessons that probably would have been valuable across both bodies of work.
I think one of the other tensions in today's work is this question of hunch versus evidence. 20 years ago, we had a strong hunch that JDAI and family to family could make a big difference. We didn't have a body of evidence, but we believed. We believed it from our experience. We believed it from what we knew about systems and how they operated. And so the question is, where is the place for good hunch as opposed to evidence? And when Patrick became the president, he talked a lot about evidence, and I think there was a lot of debate around, well, what about innovation? What about risk? What about a good hunch? Where's the room for that? And Patrick's response was, sometimes you just know there's a right thing to do, and you don't need any evidence to know that. And I think at that point, everybody go, okay, we're good. Now, I think we are building this question in ourselves. What is already known that might be helpful to build into our work? So there's not a rejection of evidence. I think there's a lot of interest in it. And in things that are working, how do we build the evidence? But there was certainly a lot of grumbling, and what does this mean? And what about my creativity? And I think we've gotten through that, knowing that a good idea still has lots of airspace and opportunity here at the Casey Foundation.
So I want to make sure the last three questions get said. So I want you to listen to the next three questions, then we can answer them collectively and make sure we don't run out of time.
Hello.
Hello.
I don't have a question. I just have a general comment about the panel today. I would just like to say I have been in this field for many, many years, and it is rare to have a panel of senior leaders saying they're willing to talk about mistakes that have been made, where we can do better, and what other things we can do. And so I really, really appreciate that, because that, to me, in my experiences, the leadership really shies away from that, and I just really appreciate the candor and the frankness and the honesty about the work and where we want to go here at the foundation. So thank you.
Thank you, Doreen.
I'd like to echo that. She's right. That's been my experience as well, coming from state government. I didn't often see this level of commitment from leadership to move things forward. This is week 5 for me, and on day 2 of being a part of the Casey Foundation, I went to Atlanta to participate in the annual JDAI conference. And I don't know if it was a grand design or whether it just, fell to happen that way. But while in Atlanta, arrangements were made for us to visit the Atlanta Civic Site. And I can't tell you how, as a new person, second day on the job, to have that as one of the experiences. It was just absolutely fascinating. And it just made me think, as we talked about some of the lessons learned from Casey Connections, I'm thinking that one of those lessons had to be moving forward, making sure that the projects, the engagements that we took on were those that were similar to what I saw at that civic site. Everything there, if you talk about a perfect storm, that was what I saw there. The community was involved and engaged. There was a community center that was supported by the local daycare and preschool that were on site that fed into the elementary school that was connected, and then it was all wrapped around by the community that, you know, just engaged themselves in so many different ways. So I'm wondering, is that a part of our thinking now as we choose sites or projects to engage in? Do we look for places where you have those type of perfect storm elements already in place, or are we focusing more on going into places where we can see how to bring those perfect storm engagements into being, and how much is that helping to inform our decisions on what to take on, what bodies of work to take on moving forward?
Before you jump into that, Danielle.
Use the microphone. So I had a question about making mistakes. So all of you have had relatively long and successful tenures here, which we admire as relatively new employees. And you've all, almost all, have mentioned kind of a value or a principle around risk-taking, making mistakes, and being courageous. But as a relatively new employee, and I'm sure I speak for some in the room, I mean, there's risk associated with that. And so I am just wondering your thoughts on how to do that, and if, you know, like method, because it's different for each work environment. And if you feel comfortable in doing so, maybe sharing an example of when you've made a mistake here and how you were able to recover from that and move forward.
So you guys got the two questions?
What?
Where to start?
Really? Bill, what do you want us to do in terms of?
So you can pick either question or both. I just want to make sure that you keep it down to 20 minutes or less.
Right, so I'm gonna pick the last question first, because I don't know what to do with what the plan is around civic sites and whether we're trying to lift up that particular model. But I do find it interesting, Ellen, that you come to the JDAI conference and your most lasting impression has to do with the civic
Don't feel
site.
bad.
Couldn't leave it alone.
Right. She meant to say how much she really loved the JDAI conference.
No.
It was because everybody here knew how wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm just teasing you. Make me feel guilty that we didn't arrange trips for the attendees to the civic site to learn. So I want to talk about the mistake stuff or the risk stuff. Obviously the best advice is take large, big risks and be right. It's really the way to go. That is, at a certain point, the I'm sorry stuff gets really tired and doesn't work. So you got to be right sometimes as well. But you also got to understand that this really is an environment in which you can do that, and it's not like heads roll, and you can make big mistakes. Both at points in time and over time, and be able to recoup from them. And you asked for a mistake, so I'll give you my classic mistake, which was there's a board meeting over in this building, and afterwards I get a message to come up to Doug's office, and there is sitting a member of the board who I don't know from Adam, and who happens to be the CFO of UPS, and as it turns out, a lifetime platinum NRA member, right? And I had just put a series of decision items before the board for what I thought were really moderate projects that went to figuring out how do we prevent kids from getting killed by guns, right? So it was a lot of researchy stuff. Let's try smart guns, or what, I can't even remember but they really seemed innocuous. None of it was let's overturn the Second Amendment or kill Wayne LaPierre or anything like that. And I had no idea who this guy was, and Doug has me come up, and this is Doug's mistake also, because Doug knew me well enough by that time to have anticipated what was going to happen in his office. And he says, so this is Bob Clannon of our board, and we wanted to talk about these items that the board had just decided to table, actually. And
Two in
so-
the history of the foundation.
Right. And Clannon starts going off on all this research that I was totally familiar with by a guy who I think is an abject liar, right? And that the NRA has been using his research for the last 30 years, and nobody's ever been able to replicate it or get close to it. It's sort of the research that says the more guns we have, the safer we are and the less violence we have. Anyway, so Clannon and I are into this immediately, and he is a really smart, accomplished guy who, has also thought about this stuff a whole lot. And so it's like immediately bloody, and Doug does whatever Doug does to get me out of the room, and it was terrific. And then he leads me through a 6-month process of organizing the board to in fact sign off on this stuff, and shows me how it's done. And we literally went to UPS headquarters every Friday for 6 months to have discussions and build relations and get to the point where, and I don't think Bob Clannon ever wanted to fund those things, but I think he realized that the rest of the board had been won over, and so I learned how to kind of tone it down and be a lot smarter about stuff, and that I learned that it didn't always matter that you were right. You had to be able to make it happen for being right to make a difference. So.
Good story, Bart.
There are too many stories for me to tell. Ask Bart, he'll fill you in. My advice would be, however, that the more you can reach out to several mentors throughout the organization in different places with different histories and backgrounds here and elsewhere, the better you'll get a sense of when to take the risk, I think, because you'll have a broader picture of what's out there and what the history is. That would be my advice, mentors.
I'll take up the question about Atlanta, and my answer is talk to Amaretta about, site selection and what you learned about Atlanta and what to build on, what to build ourselves, and also to Danielle about how Baltimore, which started at a very, very different place and is at a very different place than Atlanta, has learned what might be replicable in Baltimore, but what might not be. And so I would turn it over to the experts in the room. I'm going to share a mistake. I don't know if even my dear old friends know this. This was a career mistake. And it's an anti-mentoring story. So years ago, there was a transition in the foundation. The person who was running the Children and Family Fellowship decided to leave. And I was asked to run the fellowship. And at the time, I was working with Ralph Smith and making connections work. And I went to somebody who knows the foundation and is family to the foundation, really, really, really close. And also was my partner in this state-level system reform stuff in Maryland. So we were very, very dear, intimate, close friends. and I respect his opinion, even though his guidance was wrong on this one. But I said, well, you know, I would really like to do this, and his advice was, don't do it. He said, this foundation is not about leadership development. There's no future in that. You need to stick with the more programmatic work, and that, you know, you'd be foolish to take this little piece of work. You'll never get any place here. And even though my heart, it's work that I really wanted to do, I took that advice. Somebody else was given the opportunity, and they took it, and to my good fortune, that person didn't work out. And a year and a half later, they came back to me, and then I said, well, the hell with what you said. I know in my heart this is work that I really want to do, and it doesn't matter that it might not have a big future. It's important work, and I think it's good work, and so I decided to do it. As it turned out, it became important work at the foundation and very, very well supported, but I could have lost the opportunity to follow my heart in the work. So my advice from my mistake is follow your heart in the work, and you'll be happier, you'll do better work, and it will have its place, whatever that turns out to be.
And on that note, let me just take a moment to say, on behalf of all of our new staff, thank you very much for speaking and being honest.
Thank you. Your questions were great. You're
Yep.
a terrific audience and good facilitator, Mr. Bill.
So, Steph, we have 3 more minutes. I have been watching the clock to do the last
Do we
20
get up?
minutes. You guys can
Okay.
to do the last 20 minutes of our agenda. But I've been speaking to Steph telepathically, and I am very confident that we're going to make it through this. I think you have on the flip chart our reflection question.
If I sound too loud, it's okay. All right. Yes, so we do try to be very mindful and respectful of time. So we want to give you a little bit of a break before we move downstairs for the new staff reception. But just in thinking about, you know, when Bill set the groundwork for today about what we thought about when we were thinking about bringing you all together to hear a bit about Casey history, we realized that none of you are going to be asked to take the quiz about what are all the initiatives that we've done in the past, what is all of the work that we've done, and no one's going to give you that quiz. But what we realized is that we all have, each one of you, each one of us has opportunities, no matter what group we're in, what position we sit in, to make decisions, to engage in our work, and to engage with each other every day. And what we hope are ways that enact some of these key values and principles and beliefs and lessons that you've heard the panel talk about, that we heard Doug talk about, that we've heard Patrick talk about at staff meetings. And so what we would like you to do overnight, I'm going to give you a bit of a homework assignment, is to think about, this is written on your agenda, and I have it written down here somewhere. Just hang this up. So reflecting on some of the key values, lessons, principles that you've heard everybody talk about, thank you. What are the ones that resonate most with you and that seem most important for your work, and why? Right, so that's what we're going to open our discussion tomorrow, our Casey history discussion on, and we'll have our Casey Today discussion on. We'll have a chance to hear from some more people talking about this, but just take some time to think about overnight what resonates most with you, and how does what seems most important to your work. Any questions about that?
Then just
Okay.
let me say thank you. Our reception will start at 5, and we will see you in the morning.
I do have one more.
Oh.
I actually will have one more quick thing. So we are very intentional about when we bring people together to get their feedback on how things went. So we're going to be giving you a little evaluation to get your feedback tomorrow. We're going to do that. And I know a few people can't be here tomorrow, so I'll make sure to get that to you because we really want to make sure that what we're doing is meeting your needs and effective use of your time. So thank you and see you downstairs at 5 o'clock.